The stars looked cold and distant through the bridge windows of the USS Defiance. Admiral Jake Morrison stood with his hands behind his back, watching the enemy station grow larger on the main screen. Kepler Station had been a pain in their side for months. The Zephyrians used it to supply their war fleets, and now it was time to take it down. "Admiral, all ships report ready," said Captain Nick Davis from his position at the tactical station. The bridge crew worked quietly around them. Everyone knew this would be a hard fight. Morrison nodded. "Begin the attack! The human fleet opened fire!" Laser beams and missiles streaked through space toward the massive station. The Zephyrians fired back with their crystal weapons that could cut through ship armor like paper. Explosions lit up the darkness as ships from both sides took damage. The battle had been going on for 2 weeks now. Every day, Morrison watched good people die. Every night, he wrote letters to families back on Earth. The Zephyrians were tough fighters. They looked like giant cats with scales and claws that could tear metal. They never gave up, never surrendered. But humans were stubborn too. "Sir, their shields are down to 30%, reported Lieutenant Lisa Grant from the communications station. She was young but smart, one of the best officers Morrison had ever worked with. "Keep firing," Morrison ordered. "We end this today." The final assault took 6 hours. When the last Zephyrian gun fell silent, Morrison felt tired instead of victorious. Too many ships had been lost. Too many friends were gone. "Prepare boarding parties," he said. "Sweep every level. Take prisoners if they surrender, but watch for traps." The Marines moved through the station carefully. The Zephyrians had fought to the end, just like always. Bodies lay scattered in the corridors. The air smelled of smoke and burnt metal. Morrison walked through the station himself, checking on his troops. The Zephyrians had built the place like a fortress. Thick walls, narrow passages, perfect for defense, but it was over now. "Admiral Morrison, you need to see this," came a voice over his radio. It was Sergeant Ben Cooper, one of the Marine squad leaders. "What is it, Sergeant?" "You really need to see this, sir." "Level 7, Section C." Morrison made his way to the location. He found Cooper standing outside a heavy door that had been blown open. The sergeant looked confused and worried. "What's the problem?" Morrison asked. Cooper pointed inside. "Take a look, sir." Morrison stepped through the doorway and stopped. The room was large and filled with soft lighting. Small beds lined the walls, each one designed for creatures much smaller than adult Zephyrians. Toys were scattered on the floor. Colorful pictures covered the walls. It was a nursery, and it was full of Zephyrian cubs. Morrison counted 37 of them. They huddled together in the center of the room, their large eyes wide with fear. They were small, maybe the size of human toddlers, with soft fur and tiny scales that would grow harder as they aged. Their claws were just little nubs. The adult Zephyrians who had been caring for them lay dead near the entrance. The station's final battle had reached even here. The cubs made soft crying sounds. They were scared and hungry. Some of the smallest ones shook with fear when they saw the human soldiers. "My God," Morrison whispered. He had been fighting Zephyrians for 3 years, but he had never seen their young before. "They looked so helpless. What do we do with them, sir?" Cooper asked. Morrison knelt down slowly. One of the cubs, braver than the others, crept closer to him. It sniffed his outstretched hand with a tiny nose. The cub's fur was golden with silver spots. "We take care of them," Morrison said. Cooper looked surprised. "Sir? They're children, Sergeant." "We don't leave children to die." Morrison stood up and spoke into his radio. "Dr. Kevin Hayes to Level 7, Section C immediately. Bring your medical team and some emergency food supplies." "Admiral, are you sure about this?" Lieutenant Grant's voice came through the radio. "They're enemy aliens. They're babies, Lieutenant. Enemy babies who just lost everyone they knew." Morrison watched as the cubs slowly crept closer to him. "Get me a full scan of this nursery. I want to know what they eat, how they sleep, everything." Dr. Hayes arrived 20 minutes later with his team. The ship's doctor was a calm man who had seen everything in 30 years of military service. But even he stopped when he saw the cubs. "Well," Hayes said after a moment. "This is new." Morrison pointed to the cubs. "Can you help them?" Hayes knelt down and let one of the smaller cubs sniff his hand. "I'll need to study their biology, figure out what they need to eat and how to keep them healthy. But yes, I think we can help them." "Good. Set up a temporary nursery on the Defiance. Make sure they have everything they need." The next few hours were busy. Hayes and his team studied the dead adult Zephyrians to understand cub biology. They found food supplies and learned how to prepare them. The cubs were moved carefully to the human ship. Morrison watched as his crew worked to help the young aliens. These were the same people who had been fighting Zephyrians just hours ago. Now they handled the cubs with gentle care. The youngest cub, a small female with bright blue eyes, seemed particularly scared. She wouldn't eat and hid in the corner of the temporary nursery they had set up in Cargo Bay 3. Morrison sat down next to her. "Hey there, little one," he said softly. "It's okay. We're not going to hurt you." The cub looked at him with those big blue eyes. Slowly, very slowly, she crept closer. Morrison didn't move. After what felt like hours, she touched his hand with one tiny paw. "That's it," Morrison whispered. "We're friends now." When Morrison finally left the nursery that night, he made a decision that would change everything. These cubs had lost their families because of this war. The least he could do was make sure they grew up safe and loved. He had no idea that this simple act of kindness would soon shock 2 entire species and change the course of the war forever. 3 days had passed since the cubs came aboard the USS Defiance. Morrison found himself spending more and more time in Cargo Bay 3, which they had converted into a proper nursery. The room now had soft padding on the floors, dim lighting that the cubs preferred, and temperature controls set to match their needs. Dr. Hayes had worked day and night to understand Zephyrian biology. "They need a special protein that their bodies can't make," he explained to Morrison. "Lucky for us, we can synthesize it in the medical bay, but they also need physical contact and comfort, just like human babies." Morrison watched as the cubs played with simple toys his crew had made. They were starting to explore their new home, though they still jumped at loud noises. The smallest female, the one with blue eyes, stayed close to wherever Morrison was sitting. "She's attached to you, Admiral," said Nurse Amy Rodriguez. She had volunteered to help care for the cubs and had a natural way with them. "Haven't seen her eat unless you're in the room." Morrison looked down at the small cub by his feet. She was barely 2 feet tall, with golden fur that was getting fluffier each day. "What should we call you?" he asked her softly. The cub looked up at him and made a soft chirping sound. Her big blue eyes seemed full of trust now, so different from the fear he had seen 3 days ago. "Hope," Morrison decided. "Your name is Hope." The other cubs were warming up to the human crew too. Sergeant Cooper had become particularly good at feeding time, somehow managing to get even the fussiest cubs to eat. Lieutenant Grant visited every evening after her shift, reading them stories from a tablet computer. The cubs couldn't understand English, but they seemed to like her voice. Morrison found himself learning things he never expected. Zephyrian cubs purred when they were happy, just like Earth cats. They needed to sleep in groups for warmth and comfort. When they were scared, they made a soft whistling sound that broke his heart every time he heard it. "Admiral," said Commander Frank Walsh, his first officer. "Some of the crew are asking questions." Morrison was sitting on the floor of the nursery, letting Hope climb on his lap while he fed her a bottle of the special formula Dr. Hayes had created. "What kind of questions?" "About why we're taking care of enemy aliens. About whether this is the right thing to do during wartime." Morrison looked around the nursery. 3 cubs were sleeping in a pile near the far wall. 2 others were playing with blocks that Sergeant Cooper had made in the machine shop. Hope was making happy purring sounds as she drank her bottle. "Commander, these are children, not enemies. Children who lost their families because of this war." Morrison shifted Hope to a more comfortable position. "If we can't show kindness to children, what are we fighting for?" Walsh nodded slowly. "I understand, sir. And most of the crew supports what you're doing. It's just unusual. It was unusual." Morrison had been in the military for 25 years. He had fought in a dozen conflicts across human space. He had never expected to become a father figure to alien babies. But here he was. And he found that he didn't mind it at all. The cubs were smart. Within a week, they had learned to recognize different crew members. They knew that Dr. Hayes meant medical checkups, that Sergeant Cooper meant fun and games, and that Lieutenant Grant meant story time. They also knew that Admiral Morrison meant safety, food, and comfort. Morrison started carrying a bottle in his uniform pocket at all times. Hope had a habit of getting hungry at unexpected moments, and she would cry until he fed her. The sight of the stern Admiral Morrison walking through his ship with a baby bottle had become normal to his crew. "Admiral, incoming transmission from Fleet Command," reported Lieutenant Grant one morning. Morrison was in the nursery as usual. He had started taking his morning reports there. working on a tablet while the cubs played around him. Hope was asleep in his lap, and two other cubs were building a tower with blocks nearby. "Put it through to my ready room. I'll be there in a few minutes." "Sir, Admiral Clark is requesting immediate response." Morrison looked down at Hope, who was still sleeping peacefully. He looked at the other cubs, who were watching him with big eyes. "Transfer the call to the nursery." Lieutenant Grant looked surprised but did as ordered. Admiral Susan Clark's face appeared on the wall screen. She was Morrison's superior and an old friend, but she looked serious today. "Jake, what's this report about alien children on your ship?" 37 Zephyrian cubs, Susan. We found them after we took Kepler Station. Their caretakers were killed in the fighting." Admiral Clark's expression softened as she saw the nursery behind Morrison. "And you decided to take care of them?" "They needed help. We helped them." Morrison gently stroked Hope's fur as she slept. It seemed like the right thing to do. One of the cubs playing with blocks chirped happily and brought his creation over to show Morrison. The Admiral smiled and praised the cub's work, speaking in gentle tones. "My God, Jake," Admiral Clark said quietly. "They trust you completely. We take care of them, they trust us. Simple as that. The War Council is meeting next week. There's talk of prisoner exchanges with the Zephyrians." Morrison nodded. "These cubs have families somewhere. If we can reunite them safely, that would be good. What if we can't? What if the Zephyrians don't want them back? Or what if they see this as some kind of human trick?" Morrison looked around the nursery. Hope was waking up, making soft, sleepy sounds. The other cubs were coming over to see who was on the screen. They had learned that the wall screen sometimes showed interesting things. "Then we raise them," Morrison said simply. "We give them good lives and teach them that not all humans are their enemies." Admiral Clark was quiet for a long moment. "You know this is going to cause problems, don't you? Taking care of enemy aliens during wartime? Susan, if showing kindness to children causes problems, then maybe we need to think about what kind of people we're becoming." Morrison picked up Hope, who was now fully awake and wanting attention. These cubs didn't start this war. They shouldn't suffer for it. The conversation ended with Admiral Clark promising to discuss the situation with Fleet Command. Morrison returned his attention to the cubs, who were now all gathered around him, wanting their morning meal. As he fed them, Morrison thought about the war that had brought them together. 3 years of fighting, thousands of deaths on both sides, and for what? Looking at these innocent cubs, he wondered if there might be a better way. He had no idea that in just a few days, he would get the chance to find out. The War Council meeting was supposed to start at 1400 hours. Morrison sat in his ready room, checking the secure communication systems one last time. This was the first direct contact between human and Zephyrian leadership in over a year. The hope was to discuss prisoner exchanges and maybe find some way to reduce the suffering on both sides. Morrison adjusted his dress uniform and straightened the medals on his chest. He wanted to look professional for this important meeting. In his pocket, he carried a bottle for Hope just in case. The cubs had been fed an hour ago, but Hope sometimes got hungry between meals. "Admiral, incoming transmission from Fleet Command," announced Lieutenant Grant over the intercom. "Put them through." The large screen in Morrison's ready room came alive. Admiral Susan Clark appeared first, sitting at a conference table on Earth. Next to her was General Pete Collins, a stern man who believed in winning wars through superior firepower. They represented the human side of the negotiation. "Jake, are you ready for this?" Admiral Clark asked. "Ready as I'll ever be, Susan. Remember, we're only talking about prisoner exchanges today. Don't make any promises about larger peace talks." General Collins leaned forward. "And Morrison, keep your personal situation with those alien cubs out of this discussion. We can't appear weak." Morrison nodded, though he disagreed with Collins about what made humans look weak. In his opinion, cruelty made them weak, not kindness. The screen split as the Zephyrian transmission came online. Morrison had never spoken directly with Zephyrian leadership before. He had only faced them in battle. War Prime Thexus appeared first. He was huge, even by Zephyrian standards, with dark fur and scars across his face. His yellow eyes looked cold and angry. Next to him sat Battle Mother Krex, a female warrior with silver fur and crystal claws that caught the light. Morrison had read their files. Both had lost family members in this war. "Humans," War Prime Thexus said in heavily accented English. "We meet at last." "War Prime," Admiral Clark replied formally. "Thank you for agreeing to this discussion. We do not do this for thanks. We do this because too many warriors die in prison camps. The conversation started stiffly. Both sides presented lists of prisoners they wanted back. The Zephyrians held 200 human soldiers. The humans held 300 Zephyrians. Neither side trusted the other. Morrison listened and occasionally offered opinions about logistics. His ship was one of the few that could safely transport prisoners across the battle lines. But mostly he stayed quiet and let the diplomats talk. The discussion had been going on for 30 minutes when Morrison heard a familiar sound from outside his ready room. A soft chirping noise that meant one of the cubs was looking for him. He tried to ignore it. This was too important a meeting to interrupt. The chirping got louder. Then he heard the distinctive whistling sound that meant distress. One of the cubs was scared or hurt. Morrison glanced at the screen. The adults were arguing about prisoner transport schedules. They probably wouldn't miss him for a few seconds. The ready room door slid open. Hope toddled into the room, chirping loudly. She had somehow escaped from the nursery and found her way to Morrison. Her blue eyes were wide with worry, and she made the soft crying sound that meant she needed comfort. Morrison's first instinct was to pick her up and take her back to the nursery. But Hope was already climbing onto his lap, and she was making the happy purring sound she made when she felt safe. The room went completely silent. Morrison looked at the screen. All 4 senior officers were staring at him. Admiral Clark's mouth was slightly open. General Collins looked like he might have a heart attack. War Prime Thexus had gone completely still, his yellow eyes fixed on Hope. Battle Mother Krex was staring so intently that Morrison worried she might attack through the screen. Hope, oblivious to the tension, settled onto Morrison's lap and looked up at him expectantly. She was hungry. Morrison could tell from the way she nuzzled against his uniform pocket where he kept her bottle. Morrison had 2 choices. He could pick up Hope and carry her out of the room, which would only make the situation more awkward. Or he could continue with the meeting and hope that the leaders could handle seeing him care for a Zephyrian cub. He chose option 3. He pulled the bottle from his pocket and began feeding Hope, just like he did every day. Hope purred loudly and grabbed the bottle with her tiny paws. She looked completely content and safe in Morrison's arms. The silence stretched on. Morrison could hear his own heartbeat. On the screen, 8 eyes stared at him as he fed the enemy cub like she was his own daughter. Finally, War Prime Thexus spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. That is a Zephyrian cub. Yes, Morrison said simply, adjusting Hope so she could drink more comfortably. You are feeding her. She was hungry. Battle Mother Krex leaned closer to her camera. Morrison could see tears forming in her eyes. Where did you get that cub? Morrison looked down at Hope, who was halfway through her bottle and purring contentedly. We found 37 cubs at Kepler Station. Their caretakers were killed in the fighting. We've been taking care of them for 3 weeks. 37, Battle Mother Krex repeated, her voice breaking. The cub you hold. War Prime Thexus said slowly. What do you call her? Hope, General Collins found his voice. Morrison, what the hell do you think you're doing? Morrison looked directly at the camera. I'm feeding a hungry child, General, just like I do every day. Hope finished her bottle and curled up against Morrison's chest, ready for a nap. She made the soft cooing sound that meant she felt safe and loved. War Prime Thexus stood up so quickly that his chair fell over. You care for our young as if they were your own? They are children who lost their families, Morrison said. Someone has to care for them. Battle Mother Krex was crying openly now. The cubs at Kepler Station? My daughter was stationed there. My grandchildren. Morrison looked at her more carefully. Now that she mentioned it, Hope did have some of the same silver markings that Battle Mother Krex had. What did your grandchildren look like? Morrison asked gently. Battle Mother Krex described 3 cubs. Morrison recognized all of them immediately. They were in his nursery, healthy and happy. They're alive, Morrison said. They're safe on my ship. The Zephyrian leader collapsed back into her chair, sobbing with relief. War Prime Thexus stared at Morrison for a long moment. Human Admiral, you have shown mercy to our young. This is unexpected. Morrison stroked Hope's fur as she slept against his chest. They're just children. They deserve to grow up safe and loved regardless of what's happening between our species. The meeting that was supposed to be about prisoner exchanges had just become something much bigger. In the silence that followed, Morrison realized that everything was about to change. The silence in Morrison's ready room felt heavy. Hope slept peacefully in his arms while four of the most powerful military leaders in known space tried to process what they had just witnessed. Battle Mother Krex was the first to speak. "Admiral Morrison," she said through her tears, may I see my grandchildren?" Morrison looked at the others on the screen. General Collins was red-faced with anger, but Admiral Clark gave him a small nod. War Prime Thexus watched everything with intense yellow eyes. "Of course," Morrison said. He stood carefully, making sure not to wake Hope. "Lieutenant Grant, please escort our guests to the nursery via video link." "Sir?" Grant's voice came through the intercom, clearly confused. "Set up a mobile camera unit and take it to Cargo Bay 3. Our diplomatic guests would like to see the cubs." Morrison carried Hope with him as they made their way to the nursery. The other officers followed the group through their video screens. Dr. Hayes met them at the nursery entrance. "Admiral, is everything all right?" Hayes asked, noticing the serious expressions on the screens. "Everything's fine, Doctor. We're just showing our guests how well the cubs are doing." The nursery was in full swing when they entered. Nurse Rodriguez was playing with a group of cubs using soft balls made from ship fabric. Sergeant Cooper was helping 3 older cubs build something with blocks. The room was filled with soft chirping and purring sounds. All the cubs looked up when Morrison entered. Several of them ran over to him, excited to see their favorite human. Hope woke up and wiggled to be put down so she could play with her friends. On the screens, Battle Mother Krex made a choking sound. "That one there with the silver spots," she whispered. "That's my granddaughter, Whisper of Wind." Morrison looked at the cub she meant. The human crew had been calling her Silver because of her markings. "Silver," Morrison called softly. The cub looked up and trotted over to him. Battle Mother Krex began sobbing again. "She knows you. She trusts you completely." War Prime Thexus was staring at the screen with an expression Morrison couldn't read. "How many humans care for our young?" "Most of my senior staff helps out," Morrison said. "Dr. Hayes makes sure they stay healthy. Nurse Rodriguez teaches them games. Sergeant Cooper builds them toys. Lieutenant Grant reads them stories every night." As if summoned by their names, Grant appeared in the nursery doorway with a tablet computer. "Story time, everyone," she announced. The cubs immediately began gathering around her, chattering excitedly. "You read to them?" War Prime Thexus asked. Grant looked up at the camera, surprised to see Zephyrian faces on the screen. "Yes, sir. I mean, they don't understand English, but they like the sound of voices. Dr. Hayes thinks it helps them learn." She began reading from a simple children's story about friendship. The cubs settled down around her, listening intently. Some of them curled up together in small piles, just like they would with their real families. General Collins finally exploded. "This is insane. Morrison, you're treating enemy aliens like pets." Morrison felt anger flash through him. "General, with respect, these are not pets. They're children. And if you can't see the difference, then you're not the leader I thought you were." Several cubs looked up nervously at the raised voices. Hope immediately ran to Morrison and hid behind his legs. Morrison knelt down and picked her up, speaking softly to calm her. "It's okay, Hope. Nobody's angry at you." Admiral Clark had been watching everything quietly. Now she spoke up. "Jake, show them the feeding routine. Show them everything." For the next hour, Morrison and his crew demonstrated how they cared for the cubs. They showed the specially prepared food, the sleeping areas, the toys, the medical equipment Dr. Hayes used for checkups. They explained how they had learned to recognize each cub's personality and needs. War Prime Thexus watched it all without saying a word. Battle Mother Krex identified 12 more of her family members among the cubs. All of them were healthy and happy. "You sing to them," Battle Mother Krex noticed when Nurse Rodriguez began humming a lullaby to help the youngest cubs settle for their nap. "Cubs like music," Rodriguez explained. "We've been trying to learn some Zephyrian songs from the data files we found, but our pronunciation is probably terrible." She began humming a tune that Morrison recognized from the Zephyrian cultural files. It was rough and clearly sung by someone who didn't understand the language, but the cubs responded to it immediately. They knew the song. Several cubs began humming along, their small voices blending with Rodriguez's. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. War Prime Thexus stood up abruptly. "I must think about this," he said. "We will continue this discussion tomorrow." The Zephyrian transmission ended. General Collins was furious. "Morrison, you've compromised this entire negotiation. How are we supposed to look strong when you're playing nursemaid to alien babies? Admiral Clark held up a hand to stop him. Pete, shut up for a minute. She looked directly at Morrison through the screen. Jake, do you realize what you've just done? Morrison was sitting on the floor with Hope in his lap while other cubs climbed on him. I fed a hungry child, Susan. Same thing I do every day. You've shown them that humans are capable of compassion. Real compassion, not just political mercy. Clark leaned back in her chair. War Prime Thexus has been fighting us for 3 years because he believes we're monsters who kill without conscience. You just proved him wrong. And Battle Mother Krex, Morrison added. She thought her grandchildren were dead. Now she knows they're not just alive, but loved and cared for. General Collins shook his head. This is still a mistake. You're giving them propaganda material. Morrison looked up from the cubs surrounding him. General, if showing kindness to children is propaganda, then I'm proud to be spreading it. Admiral Clark smiled for the first time in the meeting. Jake, I want you to prepare a full presentation about the cubs. Everything your crew has learned about their care, their behavior, their needs. If we're going to continue these talks, the Zephyrians need to see that we're serious about treating their young well. Yes, ma'am. The transmission ended, leaving Morrison alone with his crew and the cubs. Hope looked up at him with her big blue eyes and chirped softly. What do you think, Hope? Morrison asked her. Did we just make things better or worse? Hope purred and snuggled closer to him. In her innocent way, she seemed to think that having more adults care about cubs could only be a good thing. Morrison hoped she was right. Because tomorrow, he would find out if his simple act of kindness could really change the course of a war. Morrison didn't sleep well that night. He kept thinking about the expressions on the Zephyrian leaders' faces when they saw him caring for Hope. He had spent 3 years fighting these aliens. But yesterday was the first time he had seen them as parents and grandparents who loved their children just like humans did. At 0600 hours, he was back in the nursery for the morning feeding. The cubs were waking up, stretching and yawning just like earth cats. Hope immediately toddled over to him, wanting her breakfast bottle. Good morning, little one, Morrison said softly, picking her up. Big day today. Dr. Hayes appeared with the morning meal supplies. Admiral, I've been thinking about yesterday's meeting. Do you really think this could lead to peace? Morrison tested the temperature of Hope's bottle on his wrist, just like he had learned to do for human babies. I don't know, Doctor, but for the first time in 3 years I have hope. He looked down at the cub in his arms. No pun intended. The War Council reconvened at 1000 hours. This time Morrison was prepared. He had Lieutenant Grant set up cameras throughout the nursery, so the Zephyrian leaders could see everything. Dr. Hayes had prepared medical reports showing how healthy the cubs were. Sergeant Cooper had made a presentation about the toys and games they used. When the transmissions connected, Morrison was sitting in the nursery with Hope on his lap, and several other cubs playing around his feet. War Prime Thexus looked different today. Less angry, more thoughtful. Battle Mother Krex's eyes were still red from crying, but she seemed calmer. Admiral Morrison, War Prime Thexus began, I have spent the night thinking about what I saw yesterday. You said you have 37 of our cubs. Yes, War Prime, all healthy and well cared for. I want to see all of them. For the next 2 hours, Morrison's crew gave the most thorough presentation of their lives. They showed every cub, explained their individual personalities and needs, demonstrated feeding and playtime and medical care. They showed the sleeping areas, the toys, the special food preparation. Battle Mother Krex identified 23 cubs as members of her extended family. She wept openly as she watched them play and eat and sleep in safety. You have saved our future, she whispered. These cubs represent 5 of our most important families. They are the children of our greatest warriors, our wisest leaders. War Prime Thexus was quiet through most of the presentation. Finally, he spoke. Admiral Morrison, I have a question that will determine the fate of both our species. Morrison shifted Hope to a more comfortable position. I'm listening. If we asked you to return these cubs to us, would you do it? The question hung in the air. Morrison looked around at the cubs he had grown to love. Hope was sleeping against his chest. Silver was building a tower with blocks nearby. Ben and Sam were wrestling playfully in the corner. If you can guarantee their safety and happiness, yes, Morrison said finally. But I would want to make sure they remembered that humans cared for them. I would want them to grow up knowing that not all humans are enemies. And if we asked you to keep caring for them? Morrison was surprised by the question. I would do that too if that's what was best for them. War Prime Thexus stood up. Admiral Morrison, I am about to do something that my advisors will call madness. I am calling for an immediate ceasefire in this war. General Collins nearly fell out of his chair. What? You heard me, human general. I want all fighting to stop, effective immediately. Admiral Clark leaned forward. War Prime, that's a significant decision. May I ask why? War Prime Thexus pointed at the screen showing Morrison with hope. Because that human admiral has shown me something I thought impossible. He has shown me that humans can love our children as their own. Battle Mother Krex nodded. For 3 years we have believed that humans are heartless killers who see us only as animals. But Admiral Morrison feeds our cubs with his own hands. His crew sings lullabies to help them sleep. They build toys and tell stories and provide medical care. If humans can show such compassion to enemy children, War Prime Thexus continued, then perhaps we have been wrong about everything. Perhaps peace is possible. Morrison felt something shift in the room, like the moment when a storm finally breaks and the sun comes through the clouds. What are you proposing, War Prime? Joint colonies. Places where human and Zephyrian families can live together, learn from each other, raise their children side by side. War Prime Thexus looked directly at Morrison. I want you to lead the first one, Admiral. You and the cubs you have saved. General Collins objected loudly, but Admiral Clark overruled him. It's worth trying, Pete. This war has gone on too long. The negotiations that followed took weeks. There were arguments and setbacks and moments when Morrison thought the whole thing might fall apart. But every time tensions rose, someone would mention the cubs and both sides would remember what they were really fighting for. 6 months later, Morrison stood in a garden on a planet they had named New Harmony. It was the first joint human Zephyrian colony, and it was beautiful. Human children played with Zephyrian cubs under trees that had been brought from both their home worlds. Hope had grown larger and more confident, but she still followed Morrison everywhere. She had learned to speak a mixture of English and Zephyrian, and she called him Papa Jake in both languages. Battle Mother Krex had come to live on New Harmony with her surviving family members. She and Morrison had become unlikely friends, bonding over their shared love for the cubs. Papa Jake, Hope said one day as they walked through the colony together. Why did the grown-ups fight before? Morrison thought about how to explain war to a child who had only known peace and love. Sometimes grown-ups forget that we're all just trying to take care of our families. They forget that everyone wants the same things: safety, happiness, and a good future for their children. But you didn't forget? Morrison looked around at the colony where human and Zephyrian families lived and worked together. Children of both species attended the same schools, played the same games, and grew up thinking of each other as friends rather than enemies. I almost did forget. Hope. But then I met you and your friends, and you reminded me what was really important. Hope purred and took his hand in her small paw. I'm glad you remembered, Papa Jake. Morrison smiled as they walked toward the school where human and Zephyrian children were learning together. Above them, ships from both species patrolled the system peacefully, protecting their shared home. The war that had seemed destined to destroy both civilizations had ended not with a great battle, but with the simple act of one human showing kindness to enemy children. As Morrison often told visitors to New Harmony, sometimes the greatest victory is learning to see your enemy's children as worthy of the same love you'd give your own. The galaxy had watched in wonder as 2 warrior species laid down their arms because an admiral chose compassion over conquest. It proved that even in the darkest conflicts, the human capacity for empathy could light the way to peace. And in the end, that was the most human thing of all.